All right. So thanks, David. Sort of Laven for being here. Did you want to introduce yourself beyond that? Taglines or anything?
I think that's good. Thanks. I just have a small YouTube channel there, and Scott and I are friends, and we wanted to get together and discuss this topic today. So, hi.
Very good. So the topic for today is around faith and works, and to jump right to it, it would be something like, is there such a thing as too much faith? And so the way I want to pose this to you for your thoughts is that we often talk about faith and works, and I think it's fair to say that we try to strike a balance, that we're not really works based or faith only. It's really like this blend of the works of God mixed with our trust in Him are what enable us to access Christ's atoning power. And so I think we're pretty familiar with what it looks like to be heavily based in the works, because that's kind of what the world is in general. Like, it's just very, I'm going to do it, I can take care of it, I can fix it. So that feels pretty accessible. But in my mind, the other end of the spectrum, past the point of balance, would be this too much faith, where it's like, I have so faith that I don't actually need to do anything. And some of that is reflected in some of the traditional creedal Christianity stuff. But I have some other thoughts on what it might look like. But I'll pause there. What are your thoughts on faith works, and is it possible to have too much faith and not enough works?
That's a good question. All of those are good questions. And I think this is something where having too much faith on the surface, it depends how you define it, right? Because having too much faith, meaning that you don't do anything about that faith, is that is that how you define it, or are we not defining faith correctly? As Joseph Smith said, faith is a principle of action, and so it's something that leads you to the action. So if you're having faith but not doing the action, is it really faith in the first place? These are all interesting philosophical questions that kind of spring to mind.
Very good. So if you have too much faith, it would really be a matter of defining faith as something that requires no works, like an excessive amount of faith. So here's my next question. So I have actually known people and been close to people that have this faith that I, over time, learned to describe as reckless, where they would basically say, um, God has asked me to do X thing, so I'm just going to do it. And I'd be like, okay, so no preparation, no thought, no like trying to calculate, figure out how it's supposed to go. You're just going to jump into this thing. And like, yeah, well, God said to do it, so I'm just doing it. And it results in things like quitting their job with no plan or selling their house with no plan. And so things that in my mind are pretty extreme, but that could also be because I don't have enough faith. I just don't have enough trust in those kinds of promptings and inspiration. So have you had any exposure to that by chance?
Yes, I have. So I have met uh, people that are just so tuned into the intuition that they receive the smallest inkling of something and they follow that with all their heart, or in whatever form that may be. And sometimes that is actually wonderful. I've met people that are extremely spiritual and close to the Lord and have dreams and visions and so forth, and they do these amazing things because they're following the Spirit. But on the other hand, I met people that are just so blown in the wind that it's not really grounded in a principle of action and exploration before you take the leap. So yeah, it's a little bit of a dangerous territory if you are simply just following any small feeling in your heart, because oftentimes you get a small feeling in your heart, you act on it, and then it turns into some other direction, but you wouldn't have discovered that other direction unless you acted on it in the first place, right?
Yeah, now it becomes a kind of triple balance where you hear people say that like don't listen to your heart because you can't trust your heart. What you can trust is logic, what you can see, what you see in scriptures, what you can ration with the scriptures, the Bible. And I think that there's a lot of truth to being in balance there as well. Like, again, I've seen actually they have a term for this, right? This is what borderline personality disorder is a disorder, a mental disorder that is defined by whatever you feel is fact. Like your feelings become your reality immediately. And so if you feel like somebody has hurt you, it means they have hurt you. Whether or not that's a reality for anybody else but you, it doesn't matter. But because you feel that way, it becomes that way in your reality. And so it's interesting that if you were to kind of map that onto the faith experience, it's like whatever prompting I feel must be a prompting from God. Therefore, dive in, full blown, everything goes. Prompting is the only thing that matter. I've known people that struggle with that, and it can be difficult because I have had zero success trying to convince people like that of any other way of seeing it. It seems like once you kind of get stuck in that, it's really hard to help people. They can help themselves. They can figure it out for themselves. But it's hard to say like, oh, that actually wasn't a prompting, or it's obvious that's not a prompting because it contradicts some other doctrine or whatever.
Yeah, and actually that's the key, right? Because they have, through blind following of just the smallest inkling, they've kind of absolved themselves, they've taken themselves out of the equation. And so later on they can't go back and say, well, actually, no, probably I should have done things differently or should change my course or do things differently, because they'll continually point back and say, God told me to do that. And so they have taken themselves out of the equation. So a couple of anecdotes here. Number one is I'm divorced, and I, through prayer and fasting, I ended up at the state where I was going to go ahead with this, and I never got the answer that attaboy, like pat on the back, go get divorced. I made the decision for myself, and I asked if it was okay, and I got the clear answer that it was okay. But David, but I had a clear impression that it was on me. It was me that made the decision. And it wasn't that I could go back and say, well, God told me to do that, so why am I unhappy now a few years in the future, right? I had to own it and take that on myself. Second kind of anecdote was just recently matched with a woman on Mutual. We were chatting. We hadn't met each other yet, but very shortly in the conversation, she said that we didn't even know each other very well at all. Like, this is like 5 minutes into the conversation, and or 10 minutes or whatever. And she said that I feel like our lives are going to take different directions, and God's telling me that we're not for each other. And I was like, okay, well, I let that go, obviously, because that's her feeling. But how can you know with that little information, right? And if she's watching this, I'm not, I'm just trying to like give examples here, and I respect her decision and her feelings because she was actually a very spiritual person and is totally entitled to these kinds of feelings and thoughts, and it might totally be correct. But as for me, if I got that 5 minutes into a conversation, I wouldn't be able to yet make the decision and the determination yet that our lives were going to take different directions because I just didn't have enough data to go on, right? So for me, there's a little bit more, the scales tip a little bit more in the sense of needing to, I would have the feeling, but then I need to search it out. But not everyone's that way. I think the balance is different for different people. That's how I felt when I heard that. I was like, well, for me, I would have preferred to chat a little more, but I totally respect that. So in the same sense, like we have to figure it out for ourselves, we also have to not judge other people's
Yeah.
scales and their balance and what they think is important, right?
Yeah, I think it's amazing how much independence, responsibility, how much freedom we have to create the relationship that we want with the spirit. And the right relationship for one person is going to look different than the right relationship for another person with the spirit. And there's some guidelines there, I think, I think that there's some limitations to what somebody might be able to expect from the spirit, and which is probably a different topic. But it is interesting that even within the limits that the spirit operates in, he is able to have individualized relationships with everybody in really cool ways. So yeah, I
Absolutely.
agree with you. It does remind me of kind of the old wives' tale. I mean, I know it's true, but I've never seen it. But there's like the thing where we used to talk about this at BYU, is so funny. How a girl guy would be dating, and then all of a sudden it gets real serious because on the third date the guy comes to him and is like, okay, so I fasted and prayed, And this
It's
is
like the opposite of my story, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The opposite
Yeah.
is true. Like you, the Spirit told me that you are my future wife. And apparently that, had to have worked at some point with somebody somewhere. I don't know. But the counsel that we got in my generation was like basically if anybody ever tells you that, run. Like that's a bad way to do it. That's not how it works. And we had apostles telling us that, and it got around in much different ways. But that's an example of a limitation to the Spirit, and how you might have um, a lot of faith and be very spiritual, but maybe you're tilting towards reckless faith if you're receiving answers from the Spirit that are outside your stewardship. And that's how it was put to us.
Yeah, totally. I do have a friend that had that experience you described. He was the one to say that I fasted and prayed, and within 3 days I knew I was going to marry you, and it did work out. I just visited them recently, but I do think that's the minority, and you probably should run as a general rule if that is your case.
But
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 not
he
always.
but he told his girlfriend the story, or did he keep it to himself? Like,
I'll have to. I don't remember the details, but I think he told his girlfriend pretty early on. Yeah,
because I think there's a big difference between knowing or feeling a prompting from the Spirit that the person's the right person versus telling them that you received a prompting and that they're going to marry you. Like that is pretty different.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And this whole idea of faith versus works, and can I have too much faith, and also the corollary, can I have too much works? I think that one's clear that you can be too focused on the works without the faith, so that's probably less of a debate. But it's also kind of ties into the whole, grace versus works. Just in the gospel, should I be more focused on the belief and that Jesus is atonement is going to cover me, or should I be working to sort of earn that, or should I be somewhere in the middle? And I think that's just a funny way to frame it, because as I said earlier in the conversation, like Joseph Smith actually thought of faith as encapsulating works. He thought as faith as something that motivates action and motivates people to act on things and to do the works. And so you don't sort of get one without the other. They're coupled together,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it talks
And
about
if
that
you
in the
do have
Bible.
yeah, if you do have one without the other, it's not true faith and it's not true works.
Yeah. Yeah, it talks about that in the book of James. I think it's pretty clear, which is all again strange as to how some of these concepts get developed over time. One of the things that you mentioned that was actually pretty important for me in some of my exploration of this concept is that if you are headed to the side of the spectrum where you are faithful to the point of just not questioning anything that you feel or think or what, you get to a point where you have taken yourself out of the equation. And when I was exploring this, the term that came to me was surrendering your agency. And eventually you have to get to the point where you're asking yourself, am I or are they surrendering their agency to God or to the Spirit? And there's this weird concept where God asks you to follow him. And the ultimate sacrifice that we can give him is that we choose to follow him. But it does have to be your choice. You can't just say, I'm not going to choose, I'm not going to think about it, I'm just going to do, like I'm going to be some kind of a robot for God. And that's not actually how it works, because there's this fine line. I mean, it goes from good to bad so quick, where you realize that Satan had this plan where he said, "Hey, I'll take care of you as long as you become my robot." And
Mm-hmm.
we can't cross that line. We have to be faithful enough to give our agency to God, but not stop making choices and say, "Oh, I don't have to think about this. I'm just going to do it." Like one classic example for me is paying tithing. Like, do I pay tithing and actually consecrate my sacrifice to God? Or do I say I don't want to think about it because it's too painful to think about how much money I give or whatever. So I'm just going to do it without thinking about it, and that turns me into this God robot, just checking the lists and stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. And I do think that, you know, God, the Father, has certain demands as the demands of justice, right? And God, the Son, Jesus, has also certain demands or asks of us, and he takes on these demands of justice and asks different things of us. And we don't do those things as a like the things that Jesus is asking us to do. They aren't the same as, nor do they ever replace the things that we would have to do for the demands of justice.
Right.
But instead, it's just sort of a precondition for Christ being able to um, provide the redemption from sin and from death. And so I also think, I suppose Satan's plan too had certain demands, but they would be fulfilled in sort of this other robotic type of way where we wouldn't have the choice to be able to opt in and choose to follow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very like primary way of thinking about it. I know that's not exactly how the plan of salvation spells out. We don't actually teach that there was some kind of a deal that Satan was going to strike with us. Like he was trying to destroy and plunder and everything. But the concept that I can obey God by just falling into some kind of a pattern and being like, I'm a commandment obeyer and I don't have to think about the sacrifices that I'm making. It just doesn't work like that in my experience. And I'll be
Yeah,
more specific. Be more specific. So where this came up with some of the people that I was talking to about it, they kind of got into this mode of really being super hypersensitive to their feelings. And then once they zeroed in on the feeling that was identified as a prompting and from God, they would do it, and there would be nothing that could stand in their way, nothing that would change their mind. And that's kind of where I was like, so you'll never change your mind on this thing? Like, well, no, because I verified that it was a prompting from the Spirit. And I'll be like, you verified that okay, so you know 100% that it was from the Spirit, and you're assuming that the Spirit would never change its mind, and therefore you're going to commit your whole life to this thing based based on this little formula that you've developed. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so if your agency's a formula, that's probably not good. So that was my way of trying to talk to them and understanding of like where I draw the line. If I was ever to do anything like that, I'd be like, okay, if I've formalized the process for hearing God, then that gives basically Satan an algorithm to copy.
hmm.
And if he can copy the algorithm, then I'm screwed. I mean, that's why there's the whole thing of like listen to the Spirit, because listening to the Spirit can look all kinds of different ways and colors and sizes depending on what's going on, and you can really never formalize it.
Right. And regarding like the Spirit changing their mind, or you know, some plan which God has for you changing course over time, I totally think that's possible. Of course, like the principles are unchanging. The principles of Christ trying to draw all men unto himself, that's unchanging. But things happen in the world where somebody goes off and does something crazy and somebody does something else crazy, and now the situation is different. Now the environment you're in is different. And so 2 years ago, you'll receive one prompting, and 2 years later, you'll receive a different prompting just because the environment that you're living in is different. It's not that God didn't foresee the change in 2 years. It's just simply that free will is a thing, and 2 years fast forward, there's a different set of instructions, and so there can totally be an entirely different 180, prompting that you could receive. So being able to like change your mind and qualify for continual revelation, I think, is key, right? Because just having a snapshot of revelation isn't gonna hold you very long. And I also think like one other thought I had was, you mentioned as agency, if it becomes this formula, then that's dangerous. And I think so too. There's some formulaic element though. I want to push back a little bit on that because like Brad Wilcox has this analogy where he says, when a mom pays a piano teacher to give piano lessons to her child, then the mom just turns around to the child and says, "Will you practice? Like, I want you to practice." And so the practice isn't repaying the mom for the piano teacher. The practice isn't paying the piano teacher. They're entirely decoupled. But it's just something that the mom asks of the child in order to, show appreciation to the mom. In a similar way, that's sort of Christ, paying the ultimate price and turning around to us and saying, "Will you practice? Because I want you to get better. I want you to lift
Yeah.
you up." And so there is actually a formulaic element in practice. There is diligence and there is repeated structure, in terms of scripture study and saying your prayers and things like that. But there's also, if you are just simply going to the keyboard and playing the same sequence of 10
Yeah.
notes, and then you leave and you come back an hour later, you play the same sequence of 10 notes, you're never going to progress. There's actually sort of formulaic, and then there's the beauty of the freedom of being able to, act within that instruction of, hey, please practice.
Yes.
That's where you actually grow, right? That's where you have to hold on to. But without the formula, you actually haven't got a starting point. Does that make sense?
No, I love that. I love that. The formula, you might be referring to a formula that's like the mathematical setup of the piano with like, frequencies and keys and different things. And how
I was
if you
more
math
referring to like the formula of the child's structure in terms of playing the piano and opening the book to the right page and,
okay. So the
yeah, doing what they
routine,
need to do. Yeah,
yeah,
perhaps.
the routine, the formula, the routine. And then once you've practiced it, you're really developing a relationship with the spirit, just like the student is developing a relationship with the piano. And
Hmm.
eventually, I love that metaphor. I forget about that metaphor, but it really struck me when he um, presented that. Um, okay, so I have a closing thought, and then we'll wrap it up. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, so one of the things that comes back to me with like the reckless faith, faith versus works, that topic in general is Christ is a great example of this. So he was very faithful, and at times you might even be like, "Oh, that right there is where he crossed over into reckless faith, right?" But in the end, his faith was not robotic. He was not emotionless. He was not doing it out of spite or out of obligation. He was doing it out of love. And everything he did for his father, he did for us. And so I think he's a great example of this faith and works balance and how you can be relentlessly faithful without being recklessly faithful. And you can be committed to the works that God expects of us without creating an unhealthy relationship with the works, without worshiping the works, without making the works your God. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, 100%. I love that. Yeah. I think that, yeah, Christ showed us the way, and he did have, you mentioned some reckless faith. I don't know, like throwing over the tables, but all these things were, I'm sure, uh, Christ only did the things that he needed to do in order to follow his father and to show us the way. So yeah, I love that. Thanks.
Yeah, there was a story, I can't remember exactly who told it, but it was somebody that was important in my life at the time, like a stake president, or maybe it was in general conference or something. I can't remember. But they touched on this topic and they started with this story of when they were a kid. So when they were a kid, maybe 5 years old, they had faith and they knew they had faith and they had so much faith, the faith of a child, the faith of a mustard seed, all this stuff. And so in order to kind of showcase his faith, he determined that he was going to jump off the top of the slide and he was going to float down to the ground. And that would be a manifestation of his faith, was he was just going to basically fly off the top of the slide and down to the ground without using the slide. And so he did this and broke his arm. And then he was a very confused 5-year old. And he was trying to figure out, with his parents and everybody what was going on. And he had this beautiful message of faith and how it's appropriately placed in the works of God and in the kingdom of God and how all of it ties together to build up the kingdom of God. And so I think there's lots of ways to view it, lots of healthy ways to view it. And as long as you keep practicing, like the piano metaphor indicates, that I think you're bound to find a path that will lead you to God.
100%.
All right. Well, thanks, David. Appreciate the time hanging out and everything.
Thanks,
And we
Scott.
will see you. Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks. Bye.